In the first part of the series, we got our Flask application set up. So now is a good time to set up our S3 bucket. If you do not have an AWS account already, they do offer a free tier. Since we'll be using an S3 bucket in this series, the free tier covers up to 5 gigabytes of uploads for the first year. Once your account is created, what you can do is go to the S3 section inside of the AWS console. And what you want to do is create a new bucket. This bucket is what we'll be storing all of our objects or files that we upload into it. So the first thing we need to do when we create a bucket is enter a bucket name. There are some restrictions for bucket naming. They must be unique across all the entire spectrum of S3 buckets. So yours will be different than mine. Mine is going to be Flask-S3-test. Another thing that you will need to do is select your region. So a good rule of thumb would be to select a region that is going to be close to where the bulk of your users are. And what I recommend doing from the get-go is just upload a few files, because the first task that we're going to do is read from our S3 bucket and have a table view display of all the files, or they call them objects, that are within our bucket. Okay, now that we got our bucket set up, the next important step is to grab the access key and the secret access key. They all look something like this. So what you have to do, if you have not done so already, is log in, go to the IAM console, and then access your keys. This is good for setting up the command line interface, which the package that we're going to be using can use under the hood. Otherwise, we can set up our keys using environment variables, and we'll go over that also. But the next step before we can go any further is being able to access these keys. Okay, so returning to our editor. So what we need to do is we need to install another package. We're going to install the Boto 3 package. That's going to be how we interface with the Amazon S3 bucket. And we're going to do that using pip. Now once we have that, if you notice, Boto Core is installed as a dependency. So what Boto 3 gives us is basically a much cleaner and easier way of interacting with the various services within AWS. But Boto Core is it's much older. It's what's being used under the hood. Okay, so there's a couple ways to set up the AWS CLI. We can do that with Homebrew, AWS CLI. So we can do it like this, or we can just use pip. Make sure you do this in the global scope. Like right now, we're in the virtual environment. As we can see, the venv is on the left. But we don't want this installed in our virtual environment. We want this installed in our global Python. And that would be the command pip install AWS CLI. The deactivate command will take you out of the virtual environment, but then you can install the AWS CLI, then reactivate. So when this is installed, you can run the command AWS configure. And that is a very easy way to walk through the steps. It'll ask for the key, then the secret key, and it's very easy to set it up that way. Now we could also use environment variables. So I'm going to go ahead and create an environment file, a .env. And we're going to put a few extra things in here. It's also really easy to, let me put this in the right window. So if you're using a tool like virtual environment, so every time you CD into this, it'll activate. So, I mean, it's convenient to set up this environment file. So the first thing that we're going to do is, before we get to the S3 stuff, we're going to make sure it activates. This is for our virtual environment. And then we can set a couple of environment variables, the Flask app and the Flask debug. So we're exporting Flask app as app.py, which is our entry point. and Flask debug set to 1. That way every time we make a change, the server will update the code. Okay, so we set up 3 extra environment variables, one for the bucket name of the S3 bucket, then one for the key, and then one for the secret. And then you just swap out these placeholders with your actual credentials. Now that we have that, we can set up a config file. So we'll make a new file called config.py. And the first thing we're going to need is the OS. And we're going to be using this to grab our environment variables. So we're going to get the environment variable that we put in the other file in the .env file. And we'll just make 2 more variables. The next one is going to be the key. And the final one is going to be the secret. And so we have a different naming. Let's just change the one in the environment file to secret just to make it shorter. So if we're going this route with the config, we need to create our S3 client. And so we're going to need to import Boto3. And we also need to import our variables from our constants from the config file. And before we new up our Flask application, what we need to do is set up our client. We're going to make that S3. And set our access key ID along with the secret. Okay, so the next step we're gonna create a separate route just to list the files that we have so far. So I'm gonna define a new route, called it files. And let's set up a new variable called S3 resource. And once we have that, we can grab our bucket. And so what we can get now is we can grab all the summaries. The summaries are going to give us the key, which is the file name, and then the last modified. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a new variable called summaries. So we want to call mybucket.objects.all. And so let's just return a new template. We'll call this files.html. And we're going to pass in some variables to our template. So we're going to pass the mybucket and then pass in files and make that equal to the summaries. So this new file, we need to actually create that. So let's open up templates directory, go to new file. So this is very similar to our index.html. We're using Flask Bootstrap, so that's going to give us a base HTML file to start with that has Bootstrap in it already. Let's go ahead and add a new block. And what we can do is we could, so the top HTML tag is just going to be, it's not going to have any language set, so we're going to set a language attribute. And we'll set that to EN for English. And so we need to have an end block. And let's change the name of the title. Let's call it S3 object list. Okay, so what we're going to have is, since we have Bootstrap already, this is going to be in the body where the main content is going to go. I'm going to have put a new class of container. And let's set up a row with 12 columns. And so for created, so our bucket info, when we get that and pass that into the template, it's going to give us a date time. Specifically, it's going to be the date time of when the bucket was created. And just to create some separation, I'm going to set up a horizontal row. And so we're going to, for our template, let's set up a new for loop. So we're going to loop through the files. And we're going to print out f.key. And let's create a line break out here. And we're also going to have the last modified. That's going to be another date string in the similar format to creation date. Okay, that took us to our main page. So what we need to do now is navigate to our files page. And so we have an output of a bunch of files with the date times. What we can do from here is we can go ahead and make this a little more presentable, create a table. And since Bootstrap basically gives us table styling by default, it's going to make this very easy. So we're going to create a couple columns. We'll call the first one file name. And the second one we'll call last modified. And for the main body of the table, we can go ahead and loop through our files. Actually, I'll just cut this since we're not going to need that anymore. And let's create a new table row. And we're going to need f.key. And then f.last modified. Okay, now once we have this in a table, we can go ahead and do a refresh. Actually, let's give a table a couple classes. And both these classes have styling built in that was given to us by Bootstrap. And that's a little bit better. Now the dates look kind of messy. That's just basically the date string that has been given to us from AWS via Boto 3. Let's go ahead and create a couple of filters for Jinja 2 templating. And to do that, we'll install a package called Arrow, which will make this very convenient. I'm going to go ahead and kill the server here and install Arrow. And so what I'm going to do now is create a new file in our project root called filters. Call it filters.py. And no, I did not want separate tabs or another split window. Okay, so now let's go ahead and import Arrow. And we're going to define a new filter. And we'll just call this datetime. Actually, we'll call it datetime format. And we're going to take a date string in as the argument. Now let's create a new variable, dt, and we'll call arrow.get. And we need to pass in our date string. And so we're going to call dt.humanize. So instead of that long messy date string, it's going to give us something much more presentable, like an hour ago or a day ago or something like that. Okay, so now that we've created a filter, we need to go back to app.py, and we need to basically register all the Jinja filters that we create. So Jinja environment.filters. And it's basically based on dictionary keys, so we'll call this date-time format. And so we need to import this from our config, or from our filters, excuse me. Okay, so now this should be set, and we should be able to, now let's register, we can go into our template and actually use it. So we need a pipe character, and we're going to pipe that out to date-time format, and then we're going to do the same thing here for last modified. Okay, so I save that, and we're going to go ahead and restart the server. We need Flask run. And we can go back to the web browser and refresh. Okay, and then those files I had set up a while back, so all these image files, I created the bucket and uploaded the files at once, so that's why they're both set it to 10 days ago. And so at this point we can create another useful column in our table. We'll just call it file type. And so for that we're going to need another filter, so before we get to that, let's create another filter in here. So we're going to need to import a couple things. We'll import the OS, and then import MIME types. And these are both part of the Python standard library, so we don't have to install anything using pip. And we'll call this file type. And we're going to pass in the key. The key is basically the file name, or the key is what is being used when we're looping through the S3 objects. So the object key is going to be basically this, which is what we're outputting. So since that is a file name, we'll just set up a variable called file info. We need to call os.path.split text. And what that's going to do is split off the file extension, is what we're going to be using. Because we don't have access to the file. The file is not installed locally, or the file is not stored locally. So we can't read the contents of the file, so the file extension is what we're going to have to key off of. So I'm going to create a new variable called file extension, and then so file info, that's going to be a tuple that os.path.splittext is going to return to us. The first item in the tuple is going to be the main part of the file name. The second part is going to be the extension, having an index of 1. And let's just wrap this into a try except block. So MIME types, so it's going to have a types map, and the reason why we're putting this into a try except is to make sure that it actually has a key for this. And we need to pass in our file extension in here. And so if it doesn't have a key, we'll just return unknown. Okay, so similar to the datetime format, we have to return to our main file, app.py, and we have to import it and set up a new environment filter. So now we can return to our template, and let's just make a new column, call this type. And so just like the first item, we need f.key, except that we're going to pipe it to our filter, which is going to grab the file type for us. And if everything's worked properly, it's going to say something like images/JPEG or something like that. So let's go back to the browser and refresh. Yeah, so image/JPEG, because the file is a JPG, and it looks up the MIME type based on the file name and gives us that file type back. Okay, so now that we're able to read through basically the file list of all the objects that are in our S3 bucket, the next thing we need to be able to do is to be able to upload and download the files, and that's what we'll be covering in the next video.